may be some questions, so if you just want to take a seat, all of the panelists, what a note to go out on.
I have a fear that this question comment is going to come across as more combative than I mean it, but I want to talk about sci-fi a little bit, because I totally agree that mainstream imagery of artificial intelligence can reinforce some problematic values and perceptions. But I was thinking about how we could tie this to questions of representation. And I'm wondering if science fiction can also be productive, perhaps less in terms of how we imagine, figuring or representing or visualizing artificial intelligence, and more so in terms of figuring our relationships to technology. So thinking about the role of science fiction less in a first degree order of like how it looks, and more about how our relationships to those unfold. I'm saying this as someone who just read Octavia Butler's Parables of the Sower and was so much more inclined to become a prepper than any prepper website could ever make me. So it's like, I wanted to think about, in terms of questions of representation, sort of thinking maybe anthropomorphism isn't the problem. It's that the anthros that we imagine are so homogenous, and that if we were imagining different bodies, thinking about our earlier panels, or imagining animals in a positive sense, like why do they have to reproduce us? Why can't they reproduce other things? So just wondering if those might be questions that we could ponder.
Oh, absolutely. And I should say, I love science fiction. I think science fiction should be required reading for everyone in school. I think it really opens your mind up to, different possibilities and has exactly the effect that you say. So yes, I think it can be very helpful. I sort of, I guess, more meant, also, as you said, kind of the mainstream depictions of AI and robotics and sci-fi. I'm thinking, Terminator. I'm thinking major Hollywood movies. I'm not thinking, the science fiction that thinks deeply about society, like Ursula K. Le Guin or any of the other stuff that is thoughtful in that way. And it's just something that I've noticed in robotics in particular, that people are so primed through science fiction to have a very specific view of what the technology can and can't do, and they're not opening their minds the way that they should. So I would love to see more of the good science fiction enter the mainstream to open people's minds a little more.
Great. So we have quite a queue. I'm going to call out Peter and then Kathy. And I'm going to try to call on people who haven't asked a question yet and then get to the others at the end. But if we can do two at a time, because people are obviously inclined to questions. So, Peter.
Thanks. So I really like that ending note that Trevor left us with about self-representation and self-determination. I think it resonates a lot with this question of collective ethics that we had in the earlier set of discussions. But I'm wondering, to the extent that sort of historically marginalized groups were identified by being physically proximate in, say, a ghetto, or so recognize themselves as being of a class, of a gender, of a race, of an ethnicity, of a religious group. And now we have these algorithms that are classifying us in these inscrutable ways that are not transparent and are selectively then disproportionately treating us in different ways. How are we supposed to form a collective of a political will or a political identity or a self to represent and to determine when we are being cut up, as it were, into all of these different kinds of inscrutable groups? And so how do we get political, social action in that kind of framework?
Great question. And then let's get one from Kathy and see if the panel can hear.
I feel guilty because I did ask a question before, but this will be quick. Just a thought experiment, which I've been playing with. I wanted you guys to think about it. I feel like the language of hype around this stuff has gone from big data objective to AI anthropomorphized. And for me, I'm wondering if you can see that as a sort of doubling down of the thing where the people building the algorithm say, this is not me with an agenda. This is something else. The first one was there is no agenda because it's objective. And now it's, if there's an agenda, it's the AI making the agenda. And I'm wondering, how do we make the maker of the algorithm accountable to your position?
So I think there's something about a lot of this about subjects and objects And again, looking toward humanities-based approaches, we might want to consider about the objectification that happens throughout, right? So when we begin to look at representation and different modes of representation, then we begin to have the possibility for subjectivity. But if we stick with visualization, or if we stick with algorithms speaking for algorithms, and sort of fetishization of the black box, I think we begin to step away from that possibility.
So yes, I was trying to suggest that some of the literature about ethics and AI, which says what we need to do is build ethical AI, is precisely a sort of conscious attempt to displace attention from the people who are wielding power over everyone who's engaged with those systems. And that power is wielded both in shaping the systems and shaping technological trajectories by investing in certain forms of research, but also in the social relationships that are developed and in the affordances of those technologies and the way in which those technologies reconfigure relations between people. I think we need to understand that as an exercise of power that should be within the purvey of a democratic politics. There's a general framing of technology now is we're going to solve a problem for you. Okay, instead of seeing the problems that the world faces as things that need to be addressed collectively, we're going to wait for the engineers to do it. And even if they got it right, that would be problematic because of the power relations. Now, how we shape new forms of subjectivity in that context, that's tricky because they do simultaneously individualise us as they categorise us, which is why I think the kind of new communism of the universal basic income is kind of interesting because it's not as though we haven't had people out of work forever. I mean, you could make an argument, that argument has been made for decades. And at the very moment when you see this massive collapse of the trade union movement, we're being sold this story, and it's a different story from different people, that, it's going to be okay because you'll all get a crust. And again, you need to see the power relations about being given a crust. In that context. I don't think there are easy answers here when it comes to forming subjectivities. They will be formed, though. I mean, people will self-identify with the ways in which they're classified, and they will come together under those classifications. But the fact that people are going to be geographically dispersed and dispersed across industries is going to make that problematic in ways that we'll see them play out.
All right, so we had Nathan, Stephanie, David, and if we could take kind of short questions in a clump, and then we'll try to get some others in after that.
So we'll go. 1, 2, 3. Do you want to go to Nathan? There you go.
Thanks. I appreciate that we have kind of a range of people thinking about both art and the politics. As people propose, for example, ethics in machine learning, as well as these broader political movements, I've been struck by how the move towards ethics tries to keep power in the hands of people who are already building the systems, and how important political efforts are. So I'm curious to hear if there are kind of the opposites of the Russian constructivism. What kinds of art or representation, what kinds of stories, what kinds of political narrative might we turn to as we try to build the movements or institutions or policies that allow us to pursue justice in this time?
Trevor, maybe you want to give that a shot.
Me? Well, I'm just an artist. I don't know. I think there's a temptation that I see for a kind of new Leninism, right? Like appropriate the means of automation or something that I'm kind of suspicious of. I don't. There's still huge power relationships in there that I would contest. I really don't know. I think it's a hard question. I really do. And even the idea of ethics in this conversation actually feels a little bit uncomfortable to me because it implies that you can almost kind of have a ethical structure on top of capitalism kind of in relation to this, and maybe you can kind of around the edges a little bit, but I don't think that's where we're at, especially with these kind of systems evolving so much faster than the regulatory frameworks around them, which basically don't exist. Even in Europe, which is much better than the US on this stuff, there's still, thousands of years behind in terms of technology time. And so I even wonder whether framing this as a conversation about ethics is a good framework as a place to even start. I would talk just very crudely, like, let's talk about capitalism, let's talk about neoliberalism, let's start from there.
I want to add two things to that. One thing is that right now it would be difficult to have the means, to rest the means if you wanted to, because there's no abstraction layer that an average person has access to. So rest the means all you want, but you're not making the data, you're not being counted, and you don't know what to do with it once you've got it. And the other thing, I think I forgot what I was going to say. I also wanted to suggest there are other mechanisms and means. There are things like speculative critical design, which often is ham-fisted and bad, but there's also some promising directions there in terms of designing and putting together different visions for futures. And the notion of ethical robots is baked into the beginning of machine learning. Warren McCulloch coined that term in 1956, wrote a series of papers about it, and so there was some thought to ethics back then, although I can't really speak right now to what that might have involved in detail, at least.
I think one tweet length point that we should continue to hammer home was, I think, was it Alex Garland who did Ex Machina? Yeah. So he said in an interview, he said, AI does not have its own agenda. The people developing the AI have an agenda. I think that's a really important thing to hammer home.
Or the underlying structures that the people developing the AI are in the service themselves of have an agenda.
That's too long for a tweet.
So, just very quickly, it may be that the alternative ways of making the future simply aren't about AI at all. Mass migration of peoples, the Arab Spring, for all the, troubled history of that. There's stuff happening politically at the moment that is simply not about the relationship between engineers and populations and societies, or at least not from below. And we need to keep an eye on that as well when thinking about this stuff. The future is not just going to be made by engineers. It's also going to be made by people who struggle in every way they can to maintain a decent life in the face of all these technologies that are being rolled out. It's a political contestation, and one end of that may not engage with AI very much at all.
Great. So we're running up to time, so I want to get two quick questions from Stephanie and David, and then maybe a tweet-length comment from the panel, and then we're going to move to lunch.
So I was really provoked by Rob's terrorist on TV example, and so I would just want to ask, what is it about AI that makes us stupid? We had really popular resistance to the stopwatch or the assembly line or enormous databases in the 60s and 70s, but there seems to be this democratic deficit around AI in particular. So what is it about AI that is turning off popular resistance?
And I have a really practical question. When I think about ethics and governance and accountability and agenda setting, I think about access, probably because I'm a historian. I want to know who is making decisions and why are they making them, when are they making them, what do those infrastructures look like? And Molly pointed out, of course, that there's a very long legacy of defense funding, and with it, infrastructures of classification and censorship. People like me spend a lot of time filing Freedom of Information Act requests, trying very hard to unclassify or declassify records. But increasingly also, of course, so much of this work is done in industry and is proprietary, not just the data sets and the models, but also the traces and records of how decisions are being made and who's making them and within what kinds of systems and communities. And I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about how some of your concerns about the political dimensions and ethical dimensions of AI might map onto our thinking about where the records and the traces and the access might come for people like us in this room who want to ask those questions.
Great. So the good news is we're going to have a lot of time for discussion after lunch, and we are about right at time. So if any of the panel wants to offer a quick answer to those, but knowing also that we'll have time to talk over lunch and beyond.
I mean, I just want to totally agree with that, and that I hope we get to talk about this afternoon. It's also mentioned a little bit in the report draft. I don't know if you looked at it. So, I mean, that's part of why I didn't talk about that, is because I'm assuming it's going to be part of the larger conversation today.
So just in response to the first inquiry, I mean, I think one of the key questions here is about the causal relation between the introduction of a whole series of technologies that should be seen as part of the history of AI and the massive depoliticisation of the population that has occurred across the same period. And it may be that that's contingent, that it's just about the collapse of the trade union movement or the consolidation of capitalism, or it may be that these technologies are themselves producing new forms of subjectivity that mean people just go, oh yeah, look, there's something on Facebook, that's terrible, whatever. And that, it seems to me, a really important question in this debate at the moment.